I used to think arguments were just noise, friction you endured until it passed, until someone gave in or walked away. I believed that silence was surrender, that quiet meant the end of something. But I was wrong about all of it. I didn't understand that sometimes people fight because they don't know how else to reach you, that words can be a shield instead of a sword, that the most honest thing someone can do is stop talking entirely. The night it happened, we were arguing about nothing again. I don't even remember what started it this time. Maybe it was the movie we were supposed to watch, or the fact that Jonah had shown up 20 minutes late without texting, or the way he'd made some offhand comment about my taste in music that felt sharper than it should have. It didn't matter. With Jonah, the subject was never the point. We could turn anything into a sparring match. Where to order dinner, whether the window should be open, who said what 3 weeks ago, and whether it counted as a promise. Most people would have walked away by now. Most friendships wouldn't survive this much friction, this constant push and pull that left us both exhausted and wired at the same time. But I never walked away. I told myself it was because Jonah was my best friend, because we'd known each other since college, because beneath all the noise there was something solid between us. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was something I wouldn't let myself look at directly, something I kept in my peripheral vision where it couldn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. The apartment was dim, just the glow from the street lamp outside filtering through the half-closed blinds. Jonah was standing near the window, his silhouette sharp against the ambient light, arms crossed in that defensive posture he always took when he was gearing up for a fight. I was on the couch, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees, already tired of this before it had fully begun. My chest ached the way it always did when we got like this, a tightness that made it hard to breathe properly, made me wonder why I kept subjecting myself to these endless rounds of nothing. He said something cutting, something designed to get under my skin. I don't remember the exact words. I snapped back sharper than I meant to and watched his jaw tighten. His eyes flashed in that familiar way, and I braced myself for the next volley, the next carefully aimed barb that would keep us locked in this dance we'd perfected over months and years. But it didn't come. Instead, Jonah went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant he was reloading, gathering ammunition for his next attack. This was different. The air in the room shifted, became heavier, more charged. He was looking at me in a way I'd never seen before, or maybe in a way I'd been refusing to see. His arms uncrossed slowly, his hands falling to his sides like he'd forgotten what to do with them. There was something raw in his expression, something restless and unguarded that made my heart stumble in my chest. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, to fill the silence with something safer than whatever was building between us. But before I could form the words, Jonah moved. 3 steps closed the distance between us. I barely had time to process what was happening before his hands were on my face, tilting my head up, and his mouth was on mine. The kiss was fierce, certain. There was nothing hesitant about it, nothing tentative or questioning. It was a declaration, an answer to something I hadn't known we were asking. His fingers pressed into my jaw, my cheekbones, holding me like he was afraid I might disappear if he loosened his grip. I could feel the tremor in his hands, the way his breath caught when I didn't pull away, when my own hands found his shirt and gripped the fabric without meaning to. Every argument we'd ever had dissolved in that moment. Every sharp word, every pointless debate, every time we'd stood too close or held eye contact too long, it all rearranged itself into something that finally made sense. This was what we'd been circling around for longer than I could measure. This was the truth underneath all the noise. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. Neither of us spoke. His breathing was uneven, matching the erratic rhythm of my own pulse. The silence that had always made me uncomfortable, that I'd always tried to fill with words or movement or anything to avoid stillness, felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't been able to say, everything that words had been too small or too dangerous to contain. I could feel the heat of his skin, smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something earthier, more essentially him. My hands were still twisted in his shirt, and I realized I was shaking, not from fear or confusion, but from the sheer weight of recognition. This had always been here. We've been building toward this through every fight, every moment of tension that left us both wound-tight and aching. Jonah's thumb brushed across my cheekbone, a gesture so tender it made my throat tighten. His eyes were still on mine, dark and searching, waiting for something. Permission, maybe, or confirmation that I felt it too, that I understood what this meant. I didn't know what to say. Every word that came to mind felt inadequate, felt like it would cheapen what had just passed between us. So I stayed quiet, let the silence hold us both, and felt everything in my life rearrange itself around this single moment. The argument was gone. The noise that had always filled the space between us had evaporated, leaving something clearer in its wake. And in that clarity, I could finally see what had been true all along. That every fight had been Jonah trying to reach me, that every sharp word had been covering something softer and more frightening, that the silence breaking between us now wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. I was 22 when Jonah kissed me, old enough to know better than to ignore what I'd been feeling, young enough to have convinced myself that wanting him was something I could keep buried if I just stayed busy enough, distracted enough, careful enough. I'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of not looking directly at what was growing between us, turning my head just before our eyes met for too long, filling silences with words that meant nothing, treating every moment of tension like something I could outrun if I just kept moving. I was the steady one. That's what people always said about me, what I'd built my identity around. Reese, the one who keeps his head when everyone else is losing theirs. Reese, who thinks before he speaks, who weighs his options, who hates conflict and does everything possible to avoid it. I'd always prided myself on that stability, that calm rationality that kept me grounded when the world got chaotic. But around Jonah, that steadiness felt less like strength and more like cowardice, less like wisdom and more like the careful construction of someone afraid to want what he wanted. Jonah was a year older, though he never felt older. He felt infinite, untethered, like someone who existed outside the normal rules that govern the rest of us. At 23, he should have been settling into something, a career path, a sense of direction, some idea of who he was becoming. Instead, he remained restless, magnetic in the way that dangerous things are magnetic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and shift its entire energy without saying a word. People were drawn to him, pulled into his orbit by that crackling intensity that seemed to emanate from him like heat. He turned everything into a debate. It was his default mode, his way of engaging with the world. We couldn't decide where to eat without it becoming a 15-minute discussion about the merits of Thai versus Mexican, about whether ambience mattered more than food quality, about some article he'd read 3 months ago that somehow proved his point. We couldn't watch a movie without him pausing at every 20 minutes to argue about plot holes or cinematography or whether the director's previous work had been better. Most people found it exhausting. Most people stopped inviting him places after a while, stopped trying to make plans that would inevitably dissolve into Jonah's need to interrogate every minor decision. But I never stopped. I kept showing up, kept engaging, kept letting myself get pulled into his storms even though they left my chest aching and my mind spinning. I told myself it was because we were friends, because friendship meant accepting someone's flaws along with their strengths. Because beneath all the noise, Jonah was brilliant and funny and fiercely loyal in ways that mattered more than his inability to let anything rest. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was addicted to the friction. I craved the way arguing with Jonah made me feel alive, made every nerve ending light up with an intensity one couldn't find anywhere else. The whole truth was that I looked forward to our fights, that I found myself manufacturing disagreements just to keep him engaged, just to see that fire in his eyes when he was proving a point. The whole truth was that I'd been in love with him for longer than I could admit, and the arguments were the only way I knew how to touch him without risking everything. His fire was a mask. I understood that now, standing in my apartment with the ghost of his kiss still burning on my lips, with my hands still trembling from the weight of what had just shattered between us. All that noise, all those pointless debates and manufacture conflicts. They were Jonah's way of covering the quiet truths he couldn't let slip, the vulnerable parts of himself he kept locked away behind walls of words and wit and relentless motion. He used arguments the way other people used armor. Every debate was a deflection, every fight a way to maintain distance while staying close, a way to be intimate without risking intimacy. And I'd let him do it because I was doing the same thing, hiding behind our familiar patterns, pretending that the electricity between us was just friendship, just the natural friction of two strong personalities occupying the same space. Our friendship had always been a push and pull, sparks that never burned out, tension that never faded, a constant oscillation between too close and not close enough. We'd orbit each other for years, drawn together by something neither of us would name, pushed apart by fear of what naming it might mean. Every conversation was charged, every silence loaded with things we wouldn't say, every accidental touch a reminder of what we were both pretending not to want. Until the silence cut through. Until Jonah stopped hiding behind his words and kissed me with a certainty that left no room for pretending, no space for the careful lies we'd been telling ourselves. And now, standing in the aftermath of that kiss, I had to face what I'd been running from all along, that every argument had mattered, that every fight had been building toward this, that the steadiness I'd prided myself on was just another word for afraid. The next day, Jonah acted like nothing had happened. He showed up at my place around noon with coffee and that familiar smirk, the one that meant he was already planning his first provocation of the day. He dropped onto my couch like he owned it, stretched his legs out across the cushions, and started talking about some podcast he'd listened to on the drive over, some theory about artificial intelligence that he wanted to pick apart with me. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, holding my own coffee, watching him perform normalcy with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He was good at it. Too good. The ease in his posture, the lightness in his voice, it was all so carefully constructed that I could see the scaffolding beneath it, could recognize the performance for what it was. He teased me about losing the argument from the night before, made it sound like our entire evening had been about whatever pointless topic we'd been debating before everything changed, before his mouth had been on mine, before the world had rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. He said I'd conceded his point about directors or streaming services or whatever fiction he was selling, and that meant he'd won, which meant I owed him lunch. I didn't correct him. I let him spin his story, let him pretend that the kiss had never happened, that we were exactly who we'd been yesterday and the day before, and every day stretching back through years of careful avoidance. Part of me wanted to grab him by the shoulders and demand honesty, force him to acknowledge what had passed between us. But a larger part of me understood that this was Jonah's way of offering me an exit, a chance to pretend along with him, to let the kiss dissolve into the category of things we didn't talk about. I could have taken it. I could have played along, and maybe we would have gone back to our old rhythm, our familiar dance of friction and retreat. Maybe that would have been easier, but I didn't want easier anymore. We ordered takeout that evening. Jonah came over again, because of course he did, because we'd fallen into this pattern of spending more nights together than apart, of treating my apartment like shared territory. The discussion about where to order from started innocuous enough, but within minutes it had escalated into another one of our pointless debates. Jonah wanted Thai. I suggested Italian. He argued that we'd had Italian 3 days ago, which wasn't true, and I corrected him, which only made him dig in harder, and soon we were going back and forth about restaurants we'd visited weeks ago, about whether variety mattered more than craving, about nothing that actually mattered at all. But then something shifted. Mid-sentence, Jonah went quiet, the same way he had the night before, that sudden dropping away of words that left the air heavy and charged. He was standing near my kitchen counter, his phone still in his hand from where he'd been pulling up menus, but he wasn't looking at it anymore. He was looking at me with that same raw, restless expression that had preceded the kiss, that same unguarded vulnerability that made my heart stutter. His jaw was tight, tension radiating through his shoulders and down his arms. His eyes lingered on mine too long, searching for something, waiting for something I wasn't sure how to give. The silence stretched between us, thick and loaded. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could feel every nerve ending lighting up with awareness of how close he was standing, how the space between us felt simultaneously too vast and not vast enough. I heard myself whisper before I'd consciously decided to speak. "You're not fighting me, are you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jonah's expression flickered, something cracking in that careful mask he'd been wearing all day. He looked away, his knuckles white where his hand gripped the edge of the counter. "Not really," he said. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, stripped of all the performance and posturing that usually colored his words. And I knew then. I knew with absolute certainty that the arguments had never been about nothing, that every debate and disagreement and manufactured conflict had been something else entirely. They'd been Jonah's way of staying close to me, of touching me without touching me, of creating intimacy through friction because he didn't know how else to build it. Every fight had been a reaching hand in disguise, a desperate attempt to connect without risking the vulnerability that real connection demanded. The takeout forgotten, the phone still glowing with unordered menus, we stood in my kitchen and let the truth settle between us. Jonah still wasn't looking at me, his profile sharp in the overhead light, his breathing careful and controlled in the way that meant he was fighting to keep something contained. I wanted to close the distance between us. I wanted to kiss him the way he'd kissed me, to show him that I understood what he'd been trying to say through all those years of noise. But I stayed where I was, giving him space, waiting to see if he'd find the courage to stop performing, to stop hiding behind arguments and deflection. The silence stretched longer, and in it, everything we'd never said pressed against us, demanding to finally be heard. The arguments didn't stop. If anything, they intensified over the following days, but they changed in ways I couldn't have predicted, in ways that made it impossible to pretend we were still the same people having the same pointless fights we'd always had. Jonas still picked fights about everything. He still showed up at my apartment with opinions about movies I hadn't seen, bands I'd never heard of, political theories that seemed designed specifically to contradict whatever I'd just said. He still turned every minor decision into a full-scale debate, still couldn't let a single point rest without interrogating it from 6 different angles. But now, every fight ended the same way, with Jonah pulling closer instead of retreating, standing too near, his voice dropping lower, his hands restless at his sides like they didn't know what to do with themselves anymore. I started to see through it, through all of it. The pattern became impossible to ignore once I knew what I was looking for. Every argument was an excuse to be near me, every debate a reason to stay longer, to stand closer, to let the tension build until the air between us felt combustible. Jonah used friction as cover, as excuse, as shield against the vulnerability of just admitting what he wanted. We'd argue about where to get dinner, and Jonah would move into my space while making his point about the superiority of Vietnamese over Korean barbecue. His shoulder would brush mine, his hand would gesture close enough that I could feel the displacement of air against my skin, and his eyes would stay locked on mine, even when his words were about food or restaurants or anything other than what was actually happening between us. We'd debate the merits of some film I'd suggested watching, and Jonah would lean against the wall beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, could feel the heat radiating off his body. His voice would take on that lower register, that intimate tone that made every word feel like it meant something more, and he'd watch my mouth while I talked like he was waiting for permission to stop talking entirely. I understood now that the arguments had become Jonah's bridge to intimacy, the only path he knew how to walk. He didn't know how to just reach for me, how to close the distance without the scaffolding of conflict to justify it. So he built fights out of nothing, manufactured disagreements that gave him permission to be close, to stay, to let his hands hover near mine without quite touching. One night, we fought about music. Some band I'd mentioned liking, some album Jonah insisted was overrated and derivative. We went back and forth for 20 minutes, trading opinions like blows, each of us digging into our positions with the kind of intensity that had nothing to do with music at all. I was standing near the window, and Jonah had positioned himself close enough that I could see the rapid pulse at his throat, could count his breaths. His hands were at his sides, fingers flexing and curling, that restless energy that had always been part of him now focused entirely on not reaching for me. I could see the effort it took, the way his jaw tightened every time I spoke, the way his eyes dropped to my mouth and stayed there too long before dragging back up. The argument dissolved mid-sentence. I've been making some point about production value, but I lost track of my words when Jonah's expression shifted, when that raw honesty broke through his carefully maintained facade. He took a half-step closer, close enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to maintain eye contact, close enough that the space between us felt like its own presence. He whispered, and the intimacy of it made my chest tighten. "I don't know how else to get close to you." The words hit me like a physical force. Everything I'd been trying to understand about him, about us, about the strange dance we'd been locked in for years, crystallized in that single confession. Every fight had been a reaching hand in disguise. Every argument had been Jonah's way of saying, "I want to be near you," without risking the terror of being seen, of being rejected, of offering himself openly and having me turn away. I couldn't speak. My throat felt too tight, my thoughts too scattered. I just stood there, watching him watch me, feeling the weight of everything we'd been circling finally settling between us with nowhere left to hide. Jonah's hand lifted slightly, an aborted movement toward my face that he caught and stopped halfway, his fingers curling back into a fist at his side. The vulnerability in that gesture, in his inability to just reach for what he wanted, made something crack open in my chest. The silence stretched, aching and full. Neither of us moved. Neither of us looked away. And I realized that this was the truth beneath every moment we'd ever shared. That Jonah had been trying to get close to me the only way he knew how, through noise and friction and manufactured conflict, because the alternative was too frightening to face. That being honest about wanting me meant risking everything we'd built, every safe pattern we'd established, every comfortable lie we'd been telling ourselves about what we were to each other. And now that truth was standing between us, undeniable and devastating, waiting to see what we'd do with it. I needed to understand. The question had been building in me since that first kiss, since the moment Jonah's mouth had found mine and shattered every assumption I'd built about who we were to each other. It pressed against my ribs every time he stood too close, every time an argument dissolved in a loaded silence, every time his hands flexed at his sides like they were fighting not to reach for me. Finally, I asked. The words came out quieter than I'd intended, almost tentative, like I was afraid the question itself might break whatever fragile thing we were building between us. "Then why kiss me?" Jonah went still. We were in my apartment again, because we were always in my apartment now, because his place had started to feel like the wrong setting for whatever we were becoming. He'd been pacing near my bookshelf, that restless energy that never quite left him, finding expression and movement in the careful examination of book spines he'd seen 100 times before. But at my question, he stopped. His hand fell away from the shelf, and he turned to face me with an expression that was equal parts fear and relief. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at me, and I could see him weighing his options, calculating whether honesty was worth the risk, whether the truth would drive me away or pull me closer. I watched him cycle through possibilities, watched his jaw tighten and release, watched his hands curl into fists and slowly uncurl. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked on the first word, betraying the careful control he'd been trying to maintain. Because if I kept talking, I'd have ruined it. The confession hung between us, raw and unfinished. I waited, barely breathing, needing him to continue, needing to hear the rest of whatever truth he'd been holding back. He took a step toward me, then stopped, like he wasn't sure he had permission to close the distance. His eyes stayed locked on mine, dark and vulnerable in the dim light of my living room. "And kissing you is the only way to tell the truth." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I'd understood. All those arguments, all that noise and friction and manufactured conflict, they'd been Jonah's armor against this, against the terrifying simplicity of just wanting me. He'd been so afraid of saying it wrong, of using words that would cheapen or complicate or destroy what he felt, that silence had become his only option. And the kiss had been his way of breaking through that silence, of communicating something too essential for language. I felt something shift in my chest, some final wall crumbling under the weight of his honesty. Because I understood exactly what he meant. I'd felt it too, that impossibility of putting this thing between us into words that would do it justice. Every time I tried to articulate what Jonah meant to me, the words had felt inadequate, reductive, like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. The silence that followed was heavier than any fight we'd ever had. It pressed against us from all sides, thick with everything we'd been afraid to say, everything we'd been circling around for years. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was clarifying, stripping away all the pretense and performance until there was nothing left but the simple, devastating truth of what we were to each other. Jonah's hands were trembling. I could see it even from across the room, could see the fine tremor in his fingers that betrayed how much this confession had cost him. He'd spent so long hiding behind noise, using arguments as a shield against vulnerability, and now he was standing in front of me completely exposed, waiting to see if I would handle his honesty with care or use it to hurt him. I wanted to close the distance between us. I wanted to show him that I understood, that his truth had landed exactly as he'd intended, that kissing me had been the right choice because some things were too important for words. But I stayed where I was, letting the silence hold us both, letting him see that I wasn't running, wasn't retreating, wasn't going to treat his vulnerability as something to be feared or dismissed. In that moment, I finally understood what we'd been doing all this time. Every argument had been Jonah trying to confess without confessing, try to be honest without risking honesty, trying to love me without having to say the word love. And I'd been complicit in it, engaging in those fights because they let me be close to him without admitting how much I needed that closeness, without facing the terrifying possibility that what I felt might not be returned. But the kiss had changed everything. It had cut through all our careful constructions, all our elaborate defenses, and left us with nowhere to hide. Jonah wasn't trying to win our arguments. He never had been. He was trying to confess, in the only language he knew how to speak, that every moment with me mattered, that every fight was just another way of saying, I can't stay away from you. I don't want to stay away from you. I need you to see me even if I'm too afraid to ask directly. The silence stretched longer, and in it, everything became clear. The next time Jonah picked a fight, I was ready for it. He showed up at my apartment on a Thursday evening with takeout he knew I didn't want, some obscure fusion place he'd been insisting we try for weeks. He set the bags on my counter with that familiar challenging look, already preparing his argument about why I should trust his judgment, why this place was going to change my mind about whatever preconception I supposedly had. He launched into it before I'd even fully closed the door behind him. Started talking about how I was too set in my ways, too resistant to trying new things, how my palate had become boring and predictable. His voice had that edge it always got when he was gearing up for a longer fight, when he was settling into the rhythm of provocation and response that had become our default mode of interaction. But I could see through it now. I could see the way his hands gripped the edge of the counter just a little too tight, could see the tension in his shoulders that had nothing to do with food preferences, could see the way his eyes kept darting to mine and then away, like he was searching for something and afraid of finding it at the same time. I let him talk. Let him build his argument about culinary adventurousness and closed-mindedness. Let him stack his points one on top of another like he was constructing a wall between us. He paced while he spoke, that restless energy finding outlet in movement, in the animated gestures that punctuated his words. And I watched him perform this ritual we'd enacted so many times before, this dance of manufactured conflict that let him be near me without having to ask. When he finally paused for breath, waiting for me to take my turn, to volley back with my own arguments and defenses, I didn't argue back. I just stepped forward, closing the distance between us in 3 deliberate strides, and kissed him. I cut through all the noise, all the careful construction he'd been building, and pressed my mouth to his before he could erect another barrier of words. My hands found the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric the way his hands had gripped mine that first night, and I poured everything I'd been holding back into that kiss. All the understanding I'd gained, all the patience I'd been practicing, all the wanting I'd been pretending didn't exist. Jonah froze for half a second, his body going rigid with surprise. But then he melted into it, his hands coming up to grip my shirt, pulling me closer with a kind of desperate urgency that made my heart stutter. His mouth opened under mine, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like relief, like coming home, like finally speaking a language we both understood fluently. His fingers twisted in the fabric at my sides, knuckles pressing against my ribs, holding on like I was the only solid thing in a world that had started spinning too fast. I could feel the tremor running through him, could feel his breath catching and releasing in uneven rhythms, could feel every wall he'd built crumbling under the weight of this honesty. When we finally broke apart, neither of us moved far. Jonah's forehead rested against mine, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged. His hands were still fisted in my shirt, still holding on like letting go might mean losing something he couldn't afford to lose. I waited for him to open his eyes, waited for him to look at me so he could see that I meant this, that I wasn't playing games or testing boundaries or offering something I might take back tomorrow. When his eyes finally opened, there was something vulnerable and wondering in them, something young and uncertain that he usually kept hidden behind all his noise and confidence. He whispered, his voice rough and unsteady, "Guess you won that one." The words were meant to be light, meant to inject some of our familiar dynamic back into this moment that felt too raw, too exposed. But they came out weighted with something heavier, with the acknowledgement that everything between us had shifted, that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I smiled faintly, feeling something warm and certain settling in my chest. Finally, that single word carried everything I needed to say. Finally, we'd stop hiding behind arguments. Finally, we'd found a way to be honest that didn't require armor or shields or elaborate performances. Finally, Jonah had let me see him, and I'd shown him that seeing him didn't make me run. His grip on my shirt loosened slightly, his hands smoothing over the wrinkled fabric like he was trying to undo the evidence of his desperation. But he didn't step back. He stayed close, stayed in my space, and I could see him processing this new reality we'd built, trying to understand what it meant that I'd kissed him first this time, that I'd been the one to cut through the noise. The takeout sat forgotten on the counter, probably growing cold. Neither of us cared. Neither of us moved to check it or suggest we eat or do anything that might break this fragile, precious moment we were holding between us. Jonah's thumb brushed against my side, a small gesture that felt enormous in its tenderness. And I understood that we'd turned a corner we couldn't turn back from, that everything from this moment forward would be different, would be honest, would be real in ways we'd been too afraid to attempt before. The fight was over, and this time we'd both won. Weeks later, the arguments still happen. Jonah still shows up at my apartment with opinions designed to provoke me, still can't let a single decision rest without interrogating it from every possible angle, still turns the question of what to watch or where to eat or whether the window should be open into a full-scale debate that would exhaust anyone else. He still sparks noise out of nothing, still fills silences with words that mean less than the silence itself, still performs that restless energy that I've come to understand is just part of who he is. And I still roll my eyes, still meet his provocations with my own counterarguments, still engage in the push and pull that has always defined us. I haven't suddenly developed patience for his need to debate everything, haven't magically transformed into someone who enjoys conflict. The tightness still builds in my chest when we get going, that familiar ache that comes from caring too much about someone who expresses himself through friction. But now, every fight ends the same way. Now, when Jonah's voice starts to rise and his hands begin their restless gesturing, I can see the exact moment when the argument stops being about whatever surface topic we're pretending to care about. I can see when his eyes shift, when that raw honesty breaks through, when he remembers that he doesn't have to hide anymore. And instead of continuing to build walls of words, instead of letting the noise stretch on until we're both exhausted, he goes quiet. That silence has become our new language. It cuts through everything else, strips away all the performance and pretense, and leaves us with just the simple truth of what we are to each other. In that silence, Jonah steps closer. His hands, which moments before were gesturing emphatically about film theory or restaurant quality or some other manufacturer controversy, find my face, my shoulders, my waist. And he kisses me like it's the only honest thing he knows how to do. Sometimes the kiss is soft, almost tentative, like he's still half afraid I might pull away, might decide that this was all a mistake. Sometimes it's fierce and desperate, like he's trying to pour every unsaid thing into the press of his mouth against mine. Sometimes it's slow and deep, like we have all the time in the world, like there's nowhere else either of us needs to be. But it always says more than words ever could. I've learned to read the different kinds of silence between us now. There's the silence that means Jonah is gathering courage, working up to something he needs to say but doesn't know how to voice. There's the silence that means he's overwhelmed, that the world has gotten too loud and he needs to retreat into quietness to find himself again. There's the silence that means he's content, actually peaceful in a way that still seems to surprise him. And there's the silence that means he loves me, even though he still hasn't found a way to say the words out loud. I haven't said them either. We're both still learning how to be vulnerable without armor, how to want each other without shame or fear or the need to disguise it as something else. We're both still figuring out how to build something real out of the wreckage of all our careful defenses. But the silence holds those words for us, keeps them safe until we're ready to speak them into the air between us. My apartment has become our space now, though neither of us has formally acknowledged the shift. Jonah's things have accumulated in corners and on surfaces. His jacket on the back of my chair, his books mixed in with mine on the shelf, his toothbrush in the holder beside my sink. He still maintains his own place across town, still pays rent on an apartment he barely sleeps in, but we both know it's just a matter of time before we make this arrangement official. Last week, we fought about politics. Some news story that Jonah had strong opinions about. Some point he needed to prove about policy or human nature or the inevitable trajectory of civilization. I argued back because that's what we do, because the rhythm of debate is still how we connect, still how we create the friction that lets us find each other. But halfway through my rebuttal about economic systems or voting patterns or whatever I'd been saying, Jonah went quiet. He crossed my living room in 4 strides, cupped my face in both hands, and kissed me until I forgot what point I'd been trying to make. When he pulled back, his eyes were soft, almost amused, and he said, "You know, I just like hearing you talk, right?" And I did know. I'd known for a while now that the arguments had never been about winning, had never been about proving himself right or me wrong. They'd been about creating space to be close, about building bridges out of words until he felt safe enough to cross them. The arguments had always been about nothing. Every debate about movies or food, or whether I was too set in my ways, had been meaningless noise, sound and fury, signifying nothing beyond Jonah's desperate need to stay connected without risking honest vulnerability. But the silence was always about everything. Every moment when the words fell away and we were left with just the truth of what we felt, that was where the real conversation happened. That was where Jonah told me he loved me without saying it, where I told him I understood, where we both promised to keep choosing this honesty even when it terrified us. Now, when Jonah picks a fight, I let him. And when the silence comes, I meet him in it. Every single time.